Chapter 550 The attack starts. The temperature at an altitude of 6,000 meters was very low, but such low temperatures were considered a good source of replenishment for the icy war god's armor. The thin air was filled with elements of ice, which the icy war god's armor processed to replenish the energy that had expended before it stored the energy that it was absorbing, compressed it, and fed back a portion of it to Hua Yuao. Hua Yuao was full of admiration for this armor. I'm like a transcendent Douluo with this armor on. Even though the Sun Moon Empire has already produced human-shaped soul tools, mine is crafted from unrivaled materials, and it has cost each of so many years of thought and effort. This superhuman-shaped soul tool is also crafted from the Tang Sect's mechanical technology, so the Sun Moon Empire's human-shaped soul tools are still relatively weaker. Hua Yuao was already starting to move as he thought. His spiritual detection expanded as far as he could push it. He was 6,000 meters in the sky, and he didn't believe that the Sun Moon Empire could place any spiritual barriers at this height. Not even high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools could be placed at this height. But Hua Yuao was still full of praises for the capabilities of the Sun Moon Empire's aerial surveillance soul tools. At least, he discovered that there were still aerial surveillance soul tools 5,000 meters in the sky, and even though there weren't many, every single one was relatively large, and their construction was extremely intricate and sophisticated. If not for his mission, Hua Yuao would really want to take one back to study it. Hua Yuao floated forward, and the first things he went for were those high-altitude aerial surveillance soul tools that were flying around 5,000 meters in the sky. He observed quietly for a few moments, and he could already tell what kind of soul tool they were. These are clearly satellites. They were used for transmissions and communication, and they were enormous. They could transmit all kinds of information within 250 kilometers, and as long as there was one such soul tool within 250 kilometers, the Sun Moon Empire would be able to transmit information across long distances. They wouldn't even have a problem communicating at a range of more than 5,000 kilometers. But these satellites didn't possess any offensive or defensive capabilities, and they weren't able to detect anything around them. Hua Yuao slowly came up to a satellite as he placed a small round metal piece that was about the size of his palm within a tiny crack. Hua Yuao was using both imitation and spiritual interference domain at the same time. He activated his personal defenses to the highest possible level to prepare for worst-case scenarios, and his spiritual detection covered a vast area around him from the beginning to the end. He was prepared to retreat at any moment. After all, he wasn't entirely sure about the Sun Moon Empire's surveillance soul tools. The first metal plate was installed successfully without anything changing at all. Hua Yuao retreated silently after completing his task. He observed for a few moments and surveyed the surveillance soul tools around him to see if anything was happening. The nearest soul tool front beneath him remained stable and quiet, and he heaved a sigh of relief. The first attempt was most important because it laid the foundations for what he was about to do next. Hua Yuao quickly began to shift around in the sky. He wasn't afraid of troubling himself, as the surveillance soul tools 5,000 meters up were furthest away from each other. He didn't move down to the soul tools beneath him to install those metal plates. He installed the metal plates on all the aerial surveillance soul tools above Radiant City at that height, and only then did he fly down to 4,000 meters. He continued in a similar fashion, even though he was flying very quickly. 3 hours had gone by after he finished installing the metal plates on the aerial surveillance soul tools 3,000 meters up. There were 63 surveillance soul tools of many different kinds 3,000 meters in the sky, and everyone was very far from the others. Hua Yuao also had to be very careful, and that was an important reason why he was taking so long. If he didn't have his icy war god's armor, he would even have to take breaks before continuing. Hua Yuao's following task was even harder, because there were more than 400 surveillance soul tools of all kinds between an altitude of 500 meters and 1,000 meters. There were around 270 at 1,000 meters, and there were more than 160 at 500 meters. Hua Yuao planned to forego the surveillance soul tools at 500 meters. He would deal with them later on, but he had to install the metal places on the surveillance soul tools at 1,000 meters. But this altitude was also the most dangerous. The surveillance soul tools hovering at 1,000 meters were inherently extremely powerful, while the surveillance soul tools at 500 meters would sweep both toward the ground and into the air. Therefore, Hua Yuao had to use spiritual detection to avoid the surveillance soul tools that could discover him as much as possible. Hua Yuao paused for a little in the air and readjusted his condition. He relaxed for a little before he reduced his spiritual detection's range, which was initially spread over a large area, to a small but intricate area of effect. He kept his spiritual detection's range to around 1,000 meters in diameter so that he could conduct a more detailed surveillance of all the energy changes around him. This included the surveillance soul tools waves and undulations, and how they were changing. Everything was within his grasp as he drifted down. He didn't cause any disturbance at all as he arrived next to a surveillance soul tool that was patrolling in a pattern. He flicked his wrist dexterously as he sent another metal plate into a blind spot that the soul tool itself couldn't detect. Hua Yuao somersaulted in the air with a flash as his flying type soul tool accelerated and moved him 100 meters horizontally. He avoided several spiritual surveillance waves as he flew. Hua Yuao quickly changed directions as he shifted to another side and floated downwards, and he dealt with another surveillance soul tool with yet another dexterous flick of his wrist. Hua Yuao's understanding of hidden weapons meant he was still confident of doing this properly even if he had to do it over long distances, but doing that was a lot less discreet than going up close to those surveillance soul tools. Hua Yuao had to be very careful with each installation. He couldn't allow any mistakes at all. He could expose himself with even a tiny error. What he was doing would determine whether his plan could be executed successfully, so how could he afford to be careless? Hua Yuao was moving a lot faster here than he was at the high altitudes. He turned, spun, and danced through the air as he stacked metal plates to aerial surveillance soul tools continuously. His movement was like rolling clouds and flowing water as he didn't stop at all, and all those surveillance soul tools had nowhere to hide under his spiritual detection. Anybody who could watch those surveillance waves in the sky would be overwhelmed with admiration at what Hua Yuao was doing. Every movement and every acceleration zipped through in between dozens of intersecting surveillance waves at the same time. There were some close shaves where Hua Yuao had to use instant teleportation to avoid them, even though not every kind of surveillance wave could discover him. Hua Yuao had to put safety first as he tried his best to keep any wave from touching him. After he completed the last installation at 1,000 meters, he paused in the air before he accelerated and disappeared beyond the horizon. Hua Yuao could feel some dizziness in his brain, which was a sign of consuming too much energy. He had consumed too much energy and not spiritual power, because he could still take this with his spiritual power. The sky had turned dark, as most of the lamps and lights that resembled the stars in the night sky had disappeared. Hua Yuao flew far into the distance and descended to the ground at a relatively obscure and remote area. He crossed his legs and sat down on the ground as he panted deep and heavily. Hua Yuao's face was a little pale, and his eyes were filled with fatigue. However, there was also excitement in his eyes. Hua Yuao was entirely certain that nobody else in the Douluo continent could achieve what he had just done. Not even ultimate Douluo could do that. Hua Yuao looked up at the sky, even though he couldn't see the surveillance soul tools he had worked on. His eyes were full of satisfaction in this moment. A gorgeous shadow emerged from Hua Yuao's body. It was Li Ye, the mermaid princess. She sat down beside him just like that, and brought her tail up close and placed her arms around it like a young girl sitting on the ground hugging her knees. A beautiful song could be heard, but Hua Yuao was the only person who could hear it. Wonderful melodies circled around his spiritual sea, and his fatigue disappeared like silk spun from cocoons. He was recovering all the spiritual power that he had expended at an incredible speed. This wasn't Hua Yuao's sole skill. Instead, this was the mermaid princess's innate ability. She didn't speak to him, but was just singing so beautifully with a faint smile on her face. Everything was dark around him, but it was also quiet and tranquil. Hua Yuao quickly entered meditation as he listened to Li Ye's song. He was still this mission's main director, and he had to recover what he had expended as quickly as possible. Consuming soul power was nothing much. He hadn't consumed much soul power because he had his icy war god's armor to replenish him. However, Hua Yuao needed to rest because he had used too much spiritual power, and especially so when consuming too much energy made him feel fatigued. Hua Yuao's soul core absorbed spiritual power continuously as Li Ye sang to him, and that accelerated his regeneration. Hua Yuao got back to his feet after an hour, and his eyes were already full of life and vigor. Li Ye didn't go back into his body. Instead, she just hovered quietly beside him. Hua Yuao raised his right hand as deep chanting sounds could be heard, and a grey soul ring appeared on his body. This wasn't the first time that Li Ye had seen his grey soul ring, so she didn't feel conflicted or resistant at all. Hua Yuao was in such a state when he completed the contract with her after all. This ring was evil, filled with light and a little strange, but she was slowly starting to accept it. Hua Yuao had begun to chant his spell, and deep and dull incantations rang out. Hua Yuao used imitation and spiritual interference domain so that he could hide Liu and himself. Liu hovered next to Hua Yuao, and a mystical scene occurred. Soul rings appeared from the bottom of her mermaid's tail one after another, and one would realize upon closer inspection that they were the soul rings Hua Yuao had attached to his spirit eyes. Every single one of them. The 8th soul ring, the one that was blood red, glowed as Hua Yuao's incantations were suddenly mixed with another crisp and bright voice. Every glyph or word that he chanted was accompanied by an identical one in this crisp and bright voice, and this voice belonged to Liu. Liu was a 100,000-year soul beast, and she had given a total of 4 soul skills to Hua Yuao. 2 were from soul rings, and 2 were from soul bones. The soul skill that she was using on Hua Yuao's behalf was one from her soul rings, Mermaid's Duet. The reason why his 8 soul rings attached to his spirit eyes would appear on Liu's body was because of one of her soul bone skills that she had bestowed on Hua Yuao, Merfolk Control. Merfolk Control was entirely auxiliary, but it was very effective. It could release a merfolk spirit when absolutely necessary to control Hua Yuao's soul skills, and it could unleash his other soul skills on its own while expending only half of the spiritual power normally required. That was just a soul skill. That wasn't just a soul bone for Hua Yuao as, more importantly, he had Liu as his spirit. Therefore, Liu using this soul skill meant that she was temporarily controlling his spirit eye soul skills as his spirit, and the overall effect was undoubtedly superior. Merfolk Control's effect on normal soul masters probably wasn't that evident, but it was very different for Hua Yuao because he had twin martial souls. Even though he could switch between his martial souls, switching still required energy. He also couldn't unleash them as quickly as he could when he was in his normal state, but that was different with Merfolk Control. Liu could support him according to his whims. When Hua Yuao was using his Ice Jade Emperor Scorpion in battle, Liu could use all kinds of auxiliary spiritual type soul skills to help him. That was like another Hua Yuao appearing temporarily to fight. He could also save half of his spiritual power when using his spirit eye soul skills. Of course, Hua Yuao's soul bone would have to consume soul power as he was conserving spiritual power. However, Merfolk Control couldn't grasp every single soul skill. First, she could only use those spiritual type soul skills. She couldn't use Hua Yuao's Eye of Destiny, or the 3-eyed Golden Lion's Destiny soul skills. This meant that Liu couldn't use Spiritual Blast, Destiny's Demise, Spiritual Dispossession, and Destiny's Education, because those had belonged to Anqiua. When she sacrificed herself for Hua Yuao, he became the only one who could use her strength. Merfolk's Duet, which was his 8th soul skill, was comparable to Merfolk Control. Merfolk's Duet could double the effects of any of Hua Yuao's spiritual type soul skills. That didn't include those soul skills that Anqiua had bestowed on Hua Yuao, but that was enough. For instance, Hua Yuao's incantations were considered a spiritual type soul skill, while this was also considered his 3rd martial soul. What was the effect of doubling his necromantic spells effects? The answer was quickly presented in front of Hua Yuao. 18 spectral gates quickly opened and spaced out in a line. Hua Yuao had to strengthen his spiritual interference domain's area of affect so that he could cover every single gate. Hua Yuao glanced at Liu with a surprised look on his face, and she gave him a sweet smile. Merfolk's Duet only consumed half of what he would normally need for soul power and spiritual power with Merfolk Control. What did 18 spectral gates mean? This meant that Shrek Academy's 3 soul engineer legios could come out and retreat twice as fast as they would have otherwise. Hua Yuao nodded in Liu's direction before he turned towards Radiant City. There was a remote in his hands. The show is about to begin. Hua Yuao pressed the button on his remote heavily as he spoke. A thread of strange undulations mixed with soul power and spiritual power traveled into the distance. Boom. The silent night sky above Radiant City was suddenly jolted by deafening booms as enormous sparks and flowing lights crackled above Radiant City. The city's peace was disturbed, and hideous alarms could be heard in the next moment as all kinds of surveillance soul tools in the sky were fully activated. Radiant City's 4 large soul tool fronts were also fully activated at the same time. But would that be useful? The corner of Hua Yuao's mouth curved into a mocking smile as he continued pressing the remote in his hands. Boom, 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 boom. Intense explosions rang out continuously high in the air as the loud sounds of those detonations traveled far through the sky. Brilliant fireworks crackled one after another in the sky. The soul engineers within their respective soul tool fronts inside Radiant City were all completely stunned by what they were witnessing. The reason was because they hadn't detected any attacks at all. So why would their aerial surveillance soul tools explode one after another? The screens that those aerial surveillance soul tools were connected to on the ground went black at once as exclamations could be heard in every corner of the city. But that didn't change how those aerial surveillance soul tools were exploding in the sky. The sky above Radiant City was like a magnificent fireworks show as intricate fireworks crackled again and again. There were many different colors, and there were many different sizes. A vast area of the sky above Radiant City was lit up. Shu Tianran was jolted awake amid the loud explosions. When he rushed out from the royal palace and witnessed the sparks and fireworks in the sky, he froze. What is going on? What exactly has happened? Nobody could answer him. As the aerial surveillance soul tools in the sky continued to explode, Radiant City's defense system was completely activated. Soul engineers got to their battle stations and posts as they tried to control all kinds of surveillance soul tools and attempt to discover some trace of what was happening. But the explosions in the sky didn't seem like they were going to stop at all. Radiant City couldn't get anything from their monitoring. The only thing they could get was darkness in that instant after the explosion. Radiant City was destined to be overwhelmed by darkness this night. The royal palace's linked defenses were activated as those terrifying explosions continued, covering the entire palace. The 4 soul tool fronts didn't activate their defenses because they would have to use their high-powered compression array soul tools if they did. They had expended much from the last time they used it, and they couldn't even activate it again. They had to conserve power so that they could defend the soul tool fronts. At a time like this, who would care about the citizens? Everything had happened too abruptly, to the point where Radiant City's Imperial Guard couldn't react in time. The entire city descended into chaos amid the explosions in the sky that were like rolling thunder. Radiant City had become completely blind, and that was Hua Yuao's first step. Just as those explosions were happening, Juga divine crossbow cannons were swiftly pushed out from those 18 black spectral gates one after another. The soul engineers didn't make a sound at all, but when they saw the brilliant fireworks that were lighting up the sky in the distance, they opened their mouths in shock. They almost didn't know where they were, but this fireworks show was the grandest one they had ever witnessed in their lifetimes. A cold dash of light flickered across Hua Yuao's face. He withdrew the remote in his hands. The first step was the most important one, and he finally completed this task that he had spent so much energy and almost half of the entire night on. Hua Yuao shared spiritual detection with everyone and relayed his instructions. 300 Juga divine crossbow cannons formed up in a single line as they quickly got into formation. After the heavy artillery soul engineer legion came out, the 4th soul engineer legion soul masters and the Tang Sect soul engineer legion soul masters quickly rushed out from those 18 spectral gates. The 4th soul engineer legion soul engineers didn't appear with their forts. Most of them were pushing some heavy soul tools as they appeared beside the heavy artillery soul engineer legion. They quickly set those soul tools up, and K2 was their commander. The Tang Sect soul engineer legion soul engineers were wearing their equipment and supporting the other 2 legions from one side, and everyone nervously got to work. Hua Yuao closed his eyes and regulated his breathing as he listened quietly to the explosions in the sky. Tang Wutong, Bei Bei, Xu Sanqi, Zhang Nanan, Xia Xiao, and the rest of the Tang Sect senior members arrived beside him as they gazed into the distance. Everyone's eyes flowed with astonishment and respect as they witnessed the magnificent fireworks in the sky. Hua Yuao had accomplished this by himself. He was like the Sun Moon Empire's nightmare, and he made what was impossible possible. He could still find loopholes and weaknesses in Radiant City's airtight defenses. The explosions fire in the sky finally stopped after about a dozen minutes. Metal fragments and dust fell from the sky as dense smoke covered the entire city. Radiant City was dark before, but the entire city lit up once more as the city's defense army was mobilized. They increased their vigilance and defenses across the city, and activated their backup aerial surveillance soul tools and released them into the air. The royal palace's linked defensive barrier was still being maintained, but right at this moment, the heavy artillery soul engineer legion's 300 Juga divine crossbow cannons divided into 3 rows as they formed up behind Hua Yuao. The dark cannons emanated sinister auras, and every single soul engineer's breathing was rough and heavy. The stunning scenes of the night far in the distance had already told them where they were, and those who were smarter could already figure out what had just happened. Even though they didn't know how their commander detonated the aerial surveillance soul tools above Radiant City, they understood that they would forever remember today's today's battle. They didn't know if such a scene would happen again in the future, but they were brimming with belligerence and the will to fight. Huo suddenly opened his eyes, and everyone could see two beams of golden light that were each about a meter wide and almost material blast out from his eyes. Terrifying spiritual undulations burst forward unforgivingly, and the same voice appeared in every single soul engineer's mind. Stationary soul cannon shells. Prepare to fire. Every Juga divine crossbow cannon could hold 48 shells. They would only use milk bottles and the soul master's soul power under normal circumstances to compress and amplify before firing. But today was different. They had received an order before they moved out that those 48 shells would be changed for stationary soul cannon shells. This meant that every Juga divine crossbow cannon now contained 48 stationary soul cannon shells. The shells that the heavy artillery soul engineer legion were loading were almost half of the Tang Sect's annual production. Spiritual detection allowed the dark sky in those soul engineers' eyes to become three-dimensional images, and every single person had a different target. Fire. Huo shouted as the heavy artillery soul engineer legion's 300 Juga divine crossbow cannons fired at the same time, for the first time in history. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Howling sounds appeared one after another. The rhythm was rich, like a grand and magnificent symphony. Pillars of fire and light flashed from behind the Tang Sect's members as they left brilliant trails behind them as they flew towards Radiant City. 300 Juga divine crossbow cannons fired at the same time, and every blast fired 16 stationary soul cannon shells. Hikaitu's facial muscles twitched continuously as he looked on. That was all precious money. 4,800 stationary soul cannon shells were all fired at once. Even the Sun Moon Empire, who had mastered the most powerful soul tool technology, wouldn't do something like this. But Huo did that. He wasn't stingy at all as he blasted away. 4,800 stationary soul cannon shells rose into the air, and in that moment, those bright and brilliant flashes dispersed and flew in all directions. They were like flowers thrown into the air, and that feeling was filled with wonder. Bei muttered under his breath. Did little junior brother integrate the Tang Sect's hidden weapon techniques into artillery fire? The Juga divine crossbow cannons were being developed continuously. Every 2 cannon barrels could aim at one target. Under normal circumstances, it was almost impossible for the aimers to hit 8 different targets with 16 barrels. But Huo didn't have this problem. Huo could divide his mind with his frightening spiritual power, and it was he who gave those cannon crews all 240 precise targets. Those cannons were fired in order and not at the same time, and that was the reason why everything came together like a symphony. Those explosions naturally occurred one after another. The aerial surveillance soul tools had been almost entirely annihilated, but the low-altitude soul tools at 500 meters were still around. Even though most of them just swept across the ground for surveillance, they gave immediate feedback when so many soul cannon shells appeared at the same time in the distance. The 4 soul tool fronts around Radiant City activated their linked defenses almost as soon as was possible. They didn't know what their enemies were attacking, so that was undoubtedly the best response. Intense explosions first came from these 4 corners. Radiant City soul tool fronts no longer had their aerial surveillance tools, so they were in a disadvantaged position. They could only use their internal ground-based aerial surveillance soul tools to lock onto those stationary soul cannon shells that were flying over. But everything happened too suddenly and too quickly, and they couldn't possibly intercept every single shell. Boom, 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 boom. Explosions rang out from Radiant City's 4 corners. Some shells exploded in the sky, and some exploded on a soul tool front's defensive barrier. Firecrackers seemed to fall towards the ground as they sparked in every corner. Just as these explosions continued at the city's 4 corners, sparks and flashes appeared once more in the sky. But these explosions were a lot closer to the ground, because the low-altitude surveillance soul tools were the ones that were being blown up. Almost half of the more than 200 low-altitude surveillance soul tools were eradicated in the blink of an eye. The 4 soul tool fronts could barely struggle to defend themselves, not to mention the fact that they didn't have the time to cooperate with their low-altitude surveillance soul tools so that their soul tool fronts could intercept those attacks. Second round, fire. Huo had already given his second order to fire when the fireworks cracked open at the city's 4 corners. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. A second symphony could be heard as another 4,800 stationary soul cannon shells were fired and rocketed toward Radiant City. Hikaitu closed his eyes painfully, but the Tang Sect soul engineers were more overcome with shock and passion. This was a modern battle. They were launching long-range attacks against their enemies by relying on firepower. Every one of them was confident because their enemies were far away, and there were 18 spectral gates behind them that they could retreat through. It wasn't hard to imagine how high their morale was. Boom, 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 boom. The explosions were almost seamlessly connected. This time, more shells were aimed into the air besides suppressing those 4 soul tool fronts. There were almost no more low-altitude surveillance soul tools after that round, and some of Radiant City's backup aerial surveillance soul tools hadn't even reached their optimal locations before they were blasted back to the ground. Prepare for the third round. Second senior brother, give it to me. Huo reached out with his right hand to Hikaitu, who had appeared next to him. Hikaitu's eyes were full of longing, and he couldn't bear to comply, but he didn't dare to hesitate for even a second at a time like this. Light flashed as an enormous cannon with a silver barrel appeared in his hands, and he passed it to Huo. Huo reached out and grabbed this heavy cannon, which was 2 meters long and had a barrel opening with a diameter of 250 millimeters, and placed it on his shoulder. Huo went down on one knee and peered through the scope. His left hand held the cannon barrel, and he trained it in front of him while he wrapped his right hand around the central part of the barrel's biggest part. He was like a statue, and he didn't move at all. Shooty and ran. Take a hit from my tie R. Third wave. Fire. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Every stationary soul cannon shell stored in the Juga divine crossbow cannons was finally fired in the last wave, down to the very last one. 40,800 class 4 stationary soul cannon shells surged into the air. This time, they didn't disperse, as they only had one target. The 4 soul tool fronts defending Radiant City at its 4 corners had all been bombarded by hundreds of stationary soul cannon shells. Even though they were only class 4 shells, they were still stationary soul cannon shells. They couldn't use their high-powered compression array soul tools, and their linked defenses were falling apart under such circumstances. The soul engineers and soul masters within those soul tool fronts had consumed too much of their soul power, and 2/3 of their backup milk bottles. 9,600 stationary soul cannon shells had been fired in the previous 2 rounds. An attack of this scale was unprecedented for Radiant City's soul tool fronts ever since their establishment. But how could they have the capacity to resist the third wave? All 4,800 stationary soul cannon shells in the third wave were aimed at the royal palace. The shells zipped across the sky and appeared above the royal palace in the blink of an eye. But right at this moment, the royal palace's outermost wall suddenly lit up as 16 golden pillars surged into the sky. These 16 pillars of light burst straight up to more than 500 meters in the sky. They swept across the heavens as they cooperated with each other excellently. Boom, 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 boom. Explosions crackled continuously across the sky. The stationary soul cannon shells didn't fall, and most of them were detonated in the sky as those 16 pillars swept over them. These pillars' trajectories were evidently premeditated, as they swept across the areas that had the densest concentration of stationary soul cannon shells. The remaining class 4 stationary soul cannon shells fell inside the royal palace, but most of them couldn't do anything at all as they clashed against the palace's formidable defensive barrier. They created pretty ripples one after another before they were destroyed. The 16 golden pillars were like 16 divine pillars that protected the royal palace, but just as they were sweeping across the sky, another beam of white light hovered 5,000 meters in the sky above the royal palace. It was a beam of white light that resembled a white spear, with its tip pointed downward. Its entire body radiated bright white colors, and as those 16 golden pillars moved, it also moved. It disappeared in a flash. This white beam of light was just too quick. It seemed to descend from the heavens as it pierced right through the explosions beneath it. Anybody who could see clearly would realize that this white beam adjusted its angle continuously as it flew, and it avoided the most concentrated regions of those explosions. It didn't allow any of the explosive forces to touch it. The 16 pillars didn't manage to eradicate all the stationary soul cannon shells in the end, and there were still some who collided with the royal palace's protective barrier. Right at this moment, the white beam of light that seemed like a shooting star also arrived, and immediately struck the barrier surface. TCH, piercing sounds could be heard as the white beam began to spin vigorously. It was like a drill as it impaled the royal palace's protective barrier. Alarms rang out within the soul protective barrier, and the light radiating from the protective barrier grew extremely intense as it worked at maximum capacity. Thanks so much for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Also leave a comment down below with suggestions on what novels to read.